Howdy folks, and welcome to another Unblock Me video. Today, we're going to unblock you by teaching you how to start creating backend APIs using Express. Express is one of the most popular JavaScript libraries for backend development. If you're interested in backend programming and you want to use JavaScript, then you need to know Express. To start off, let's talk about what Express actually does. If you're building a backend server, someone is going to want to communicate with your server. This could be a browser, a mobile app, a desktop app, or even another server. When we provide the ability for some other program to talk to your server, we call this an Application Programming Interface, or API. There are a lot of different ways to create APIs that open your server to communication from the outside world. The one that we'll be using is called Representational State Transfer. Try saying that 3 times fast. Or REST for short. A RESTful API is what we call an API that follows the REST standard of communication. This is a standard that is known across the world and it's very popular. Express makes RESTful APIs really easy, which is one of the main reasons why it's so widely used. Let's get started. So I've created a pretty bare bones module here. It's just an index.js that is currently completely empty, and a package.json that has some very basic data in it. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install the Express module. And why are we going to want to do that? Well, because we want to make use of it, and it doesn't exist yet. So to do that, I'm going to open a terminal. And then you can see I've navigated already to the place where my code is, where my package.json is. I'm using git bash as my terminal because I like the way that works on Windows. If you're on a Mac, you can use the standard Mac terminal. If you're using VS Code, you can also use a VS Code built-in terminal. So now that I'm in the right place, I need to run the npm command to install the module. npm comes pre-installed with Node. If you have Node installed, you should have npm. If you want to check, you can always run npm-v. Make that a little bit bigger. And it should spit out the version number of npm. And you can see I am running npm 8.1.2. If you're running a different version, that's probably okay. Usually the versions don't break things too much, so you should be able to use these same commands. So to install our module, I first type npm to indicate that I want to run that. The first operation is going to be install. That's going to tell npm, hey, go ahead and whatever I'm going to put after this, I want you to install this. There's a couple others. You can do remove, is another popular one if you want to get rid of a package, but install is the most common one. The second argument to the npm command is going to be the list of packages to install. In this case, we're only installing one package, that is the Express package. So I'm going to type Express right there. And if you're not sure the name of the package, when you're following the documentation, you should be able to get an installation command from that. So if you look up Express tutorial or React tutorial, they will have some npm or yarn line that tells you exactly what packages you need. And you can usually just copy paste that right into your terminal. So hit enter. It takes a couple seconds and then it's going to start installing. You can see it sometimes takes a little bit of time to install. In my case, it went pretty quickly because I have a pretty good internet connection, and also I've installed this package recently. So npm keeps a local package cache on your computer so it doesn't have to download it every time. In some cases, especially if you have a really slow internet connection or you're downloading a lot of packages, it can take a lot longer. Now that the Express package is installed, the next step is to create and start the Express web server. So let's go and take a look at our code. First, we need to tell Node that we want to make use of the Express library. We can do that by requiring it. So we're going to start off const, because whenever you're doing something that doesn't need to change, you want to use const. I'm just going to call this Express because that's the name of the package. There are usually conventions with each package of how you need to install it or what you want to call it. You can call it whatever you want, really, but it's nice to give it a name that you know, just so that you kind of understand what it is. And giving it the same name as the module you installed is very common. So that's going to equal require, and then in quotations, express, because that's how we require something in Node. Now I have access to that entire library. It's all bundled up in this module here, or this variable. Now we need to create a server object. So by convention, this is usually called app, which is short for application. So I'm going to say const, again, because we're never going to change this, app equals. Now how do we create this? Well, in Express, in some libraries it's very complicated. In Express it's very simple. This little guy here, this is actually just a function. So I'm just going to call it as a function. And what that will do is that is actually going to initialize a new server instance. Express can handle multiple server instances, and sometimes that can be useful if you need to have a server running off of multiple different ports, things like that. But in any case, you can create multiple apps. Usually you don't. So we have our app, it equals Express. There it is. Now, let's go and run it. Save. And then I'm going to go here, node index.js. It does absolutely nothing. Why does it do absolutely nothing? Well, this is because we've created the server, but we haven't told it to start. Starting it will actually open that server for business and allow other applications to communicate to it. Think of the application like a door. We created the door, but we haven't opened it yet. Let's talk about ports for a minute, because that becomes important right about now. Get it? Ports are important. You might be wondering, what is a port? Why do I need a port? Well, to use our door analogy, your computer has roughly 10,000 doors available for computers and programs to communicate within it. Ports are the way that programs communicate with each other. Most of those doors are closed. Some of them are opened by programs who want to have communications. So if we tell our Express server to listen at port 8000, it's going to go to our computer and ask it to open that door so that other processes and messages can listen or can communicate with it. So it's listening right now. And then if we have some other process that wants to talk to it, that process knows it's listening at port 8000. So they say, oh, I don't need to worry about 10,000 ports and sending a message to all of them. I can communicate right to the specific port. So ports help us with making sure that communication between programs is clear and that programs don't accidentally talk to the wrong place. Because imagine if we had a web server that was doing some API stuff and some other program thought it was doing something else. It would get really confused, and we don't really want that. So, back to our code. In order, the reason this is important is because now what we need to do is we need to call the listen function on the app. What that's going to do is that's actually going to go to the computer and request that it open one of those doors. So I'm going to say app.listen. Listen takes in two arguments, excuse me. The first one is the port. So I'm going to tell it, listen on port 8000. The second is going to be a callback function. Why do we want a callback function? Well, the app is not going to be ready immediately. It may take a little bit of time for the computer to open up that port and get back to the application and say, yeah, I did it. So sometimes we have various things that need to be done only after that server is up and running. We can put those inside this callback function because this callback function is called as soon as the server is ready to go. What we're going to do for now is we're just going to run a console log, and we're going to console a message that says server is running. That will let us know when we get that message in the console that our server is ready to accept connections. Now if I come in here, I'm going to press the up arrow, that's going to bring that command back, and I run node index.js again. Now it says server is running, and then it just doesn't do anything. Now you might be thinking, oh, it's hanging. What's wrong? Something's wrong with Node. Node is broken. It's not. It's okay. Node is waiting. I told it, listen for input on port 8000, and it's listening. The problem is we haven't really given it any way to actually deal with that input. So right now, if I went to port 8000, this code would engage. It would say, oh, someone's talking to me. Let me figure that out. Let me figure out what they're trying to say. But I haven't really told it to do anything yet. And so you will see if you start a web server like this, it will just hang. And it won't quit, and it won't print any more messages. It'll just sit there and hang. And that's okay. That's how you know it's working. So we need to create an API, or as Express calls them, a route. In order to create a new API, we first need to know the method. Methods are something that is used very commonly in RESTful APIs. They're basically a broad category that indicates what that API is going to do. We'll get more into this later. For now, we're just going to use one of the most common methods, a GET method. GET APIs are responsible for returning data. The reason it's so important for us to know the method is because Express actually uses that to determine what function we need to call. So to set up a GET API, we need to call app.get. If we were setting up a different kind of API, a different method, we would have to call a different function. So it's right off the bat, we need to know that method. The GET or the route in Express requires two arguments. The first one is going to be a string, and that's the name of the route. The name is basically how you distinguish which route is what route from all your other routes. Maybe you have 1,000 routes. You need to have some way of telling them apart. The client needs to have some way of knowing kind of what they're calling. Route names will start with a slash, usually. In this case, I'm going to call this API ping. The second parameter is a callback function. Argument, excuse me. I always get those messed up. The second argument is a callback function. This function is code that actually is going to be executed whenever someone runs or tries to communicate on this route. So someone comes to port 8000, Express is going to ask them, hey, yeah, I'm listening on port 8000. What method are you trying to call? And they'll say, hey, I'm trying to call get/ping. Express will look this up and say, oh, I know get/ping. Great, let me do that for you. And it's going to call this function. And then whatever we decide to put in there is going to be run. So the callback function takes two parameters. The first one is the request. This is an object that contains a ton of data about the program calling, about how the API was called, any parameters involved in it, how long ago was it called, lots of data. And various pieces can be useful at various times. We'll get a lot more into that later on in the series. The second parameter is going to be the response. The response is full of functions and data that we can set to determine what we're sending back to the caller. So the request is data that came from the caller. The response is data that's going to the caller. And we'll show you how to set that. The request is often shortened to REQ or REC, and the response is often shortened to RES or RES. Why do we do that? So that we don't have to type as much. So for now, I just want to send a message back that says Pong. To do that, I'm going to invoke a method on res.send. Send takes in some text, and I can just say Pong. This will send that text back up to the calling program, and the calling program can make use of that as it will. There are a number of different methods that you can use on the response or the res object to send data. This is one of the simplest ones. This is a ping API. You call it, it sends you back a message. Is that useful? Yeah, it can be. Getting a message back from that ping API tells you that the server is running. Sometimes let's say you have a very complicated web app, you may want to see if the backend is actually functional before you start sending a ton of data to it or asking it for a ton of data. So you can send a very simple ping command and say, hey, you up? You up? And if you get Pong back, you know it's up. There might be other problems with it, but you know at least the web server is running and is ready to listen to your commands. It's also very cheap because we're basically just sending some text. We're not accessing a database, anything like that. A lot of times people will use ping APIs for health checks. So they'll have an automated system that is checking to see if a service is up, and it will just call this ping command every 10 seconds. And if it doesn't get a response in time, it'll start sending a warning saying, hey, this server might be overloaded, or there's something wrong with it. It might be down. But yeah, it's a very simple API. So let's test it. We need to start our server again because it's still running the old code. If you have your Node.js in this situation where it's just kind of waiting, you can hit Control-C. And generally, even on a Mac, it is going to be Control-C, not Command-C, to kill the program. What that will do is that will ask the program, hey, could you shut down? Sometimes programs won't obey that, but most of the time they will do the right thing. So Control-C, press those both and your program will terminate. We're going to start it again just to get that latest code. All right, now server is running. Now I'm going to open up my browser. I'm going to bring a new tab over here. The first thing we want to do is we want to open up localhost. We put localhost in our address bar. And that's going to show you a lot of different things. Get rid of that port. No. Localhost. I don't want to Google search it either. My browser is just not obeying me right now. It doesn't want to do what I want it to do. There we go. Localhost. What does that mean? Localhost is a reference to your current computer, the one that you're working with right now. The browser knows that if you put in localhost, you're going to try to access a program running on this computer. If you have trouble with localhost, you may also want to try the IP address of your local computer, which is 127.0.0.1. Sometimes OS X has issues with localhost, so if you go by IP, that sometimes will work. Next thing we want to do is we want to put a colon, and that tells the browser, hey, we're ready to put a port. And you can see a common port here I use is port 8080. Remember, that's the door. If I go to port 8080 right now, nothing's listening at that door because we started our server on port 8000. So I have to put colon 8000. Basically what's going to happen is the browser is going to send this entire string to my computer. And it's going to say, hey, I'm trying to access port 8000. Do you have something listening on port 8000? And the computer says, well, yes, I do. Let me forward your message to that program. The computer doesn't know what the message is. It doesn't care. It just knows that that program needs to deal with it. So that's what the 8000 tells us, is send this to our web server. Then I'm going to put a slash. The slash says, hey, now that I've gotten to the right program, the slash decides what route I want to hit. Now remember, we created our route to be /ping. So I'm going to put /ping in here. And as soon as I press enter, what's going to happen is this data is going to be sent to the web server that we just created, and it's going to send that Pong back to us. And there you can see, there's our Pong. That Pong came from that function that we wrote, right? So as soon as we hit enter, Express looked up that API, said, oh, I know how to run this. It ran that function, got the result, send it back up. So in this video, we've talked about how to set up and start using Express to build backend APIs. Next time, we're going to talk about API parameters and the different kinds of RESTful API methods. Until then, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.